Hey folks, Quilly here, and welcome to the continuation of my preview for Europa Universalis 4, and in this episode we're going to talk about the final huge change that EU4 brings us, and that is trade. I personally love trade-based games. I've played as many of them as I can. If they've got industrial production, great bonus, that's fine, but I really like is the idea of movement of trade goods throughout the world, because that has been incredibly influential in all of human history. And so when the first set of screenshots for EU4 were released, and they were showing these sort of trade routes with arrows that moved from one place to another, I fell in love with the game right then and there, I think. And then actually getting hands-on the game, I really like how the trade system works out in practice. I find it's very interesting and very cool, and certainly much more intuitive, I think. Again, with a trade system, you can actually, if you're not into it, then you can pretty much not pay attention to it if you want, because at the start of the game, your merchants are automatically assigned to sort of very logical trade nodes for your nation, so you don't have to worry about it from day one. But then as you sort of get more and more involved, you find out there's a lot of ability to sort of fiddle with things and make a lot of money. And I think, especially in a multiplayer game, I think there's a lot of interesting potential there for people fighting over these trade routes, not militaristically, but simply by manipulating their merchants and moving them from one place to another. So, how does the system work? Okay, so centers of trade are gone completely. The old centers of trade are gone. Instead now, provinces are grouped into sort of trade zones, right? So every province in a particular area will belong to a trade node called whatever. And generally speaking, the name of the node is very similar to the, what you might think of as center of trade. For example, in the Iberian Peninsula, there's quite a few provinces that are part of the Sevilla trade zone. And that zone is represented when you're in the trade map mode by a square that is the trade node. But what's important to remember is the trade node is not located in any specific province, right? In EU3, centers of trade were in a specific province. That is no longer the case. Now, some provinces are still more important in terms of trade than others, but that impact is definitely lessened. Instead, what happens is this entire trade zone has a certain amount of trade that flows through it. And the more provinces you control in that trade zone, the more money you will get out of the trade that is in that node. But the trade actually flows. Or rather, it can flow. So there's a certain amount of trade that can stay in the node, and then it gets dispensed among the provinces that belong to that trade node. Or the trade can flow from this node to another node. And that's where the entire basis of the trading system goes. First of all, the trade generally flows from the Far East through to Western Europe. So you're going to start, you can imagine the trade starting as far as Japan and then hitting all these nodes along the way, and then finally ending up sort of either in northwest France or England. And then from the New World, from the Americas, it sort of flows east into Europe as well. So it doesn't mean that that final node is the most valuable. In fact, everyone at every step of the way is trying to extract as much trade value as they can for themselves. So what you do is you deploy your merchants to these different trade nodes, and there's two major tasks that you can assign them to do. If the trade node is in an area where you control a lot of land, well, what you will do is you will set your merchant to build an office there and to basically try to keep as much trade in this region as possible, and therefore suck out as much gold into the provinces that you hopefully control and make a lot of money. The other thing you can do is you can put your merchant to send as much trade as possible forward. And certain trade nodes have multiple outputs. Some don't. For example, the path around Africa, for example, tends to just have one output. So then it becomes a battle between, if you have a lot of colonies there, if you formed a lot of colonies and you've established them into provinces, well, then you might want to keep the trade where it is there, especially if you kind of have a monopoly over the land. Well, you'd love to keep 100% of the trade to just have it end right where you have all your stuff. But meanwhile, other European powers might send merchants there to try to forward as much trade as possible to the actual, main continental Europe, so that they're going to be able to suck it out once it gets to their provinces. So there's that interesting sort of back and forth there. And this is amplified by the fact that there are often multiple outputs, so people will be sort of doing a tug of war in different directions, and especially when you're talking about the duality of whether things from the east go through a land route. For example, playing as Muscovy, I had a tiny bit of trade flowing through land routes. but some are going overseas, and some of them are going to cut through the Mediterranean, and some of them are going to go all the way around the Cape of Africa. So there's room for really manipulating things, and the more merchants you have, the more trade nodes down the line that you can influence, and also there's sort of a trade power statistic. The more that you accumulate of that, the more effective your merchants will be at sort of dominating a trade route and getting the trade to go in the direction that you want. I love the gameplay feature. I think it works really well. It ties into buildings, and that when you in your provinces you can build certain trade posts and docks, which will increase your local trade power. So in the node connected to that province, you will get more and more trade power and more ability to influence whether the trade stays or not. And probably in that case, you're going to want the trade to just stay in the area as much as possible. Playing as certain nations, trade will be your #1 source of income. Playing as different nations, trade will not be significant in any way. And it really depends on where you are and what kind of game you're playing. And it's fun enough against the computer, but I really think that in a multiplayer game, you could be cutthroat when it comes to trade, and I'm fascinated to see that. Unfortunately, in my multiplayer game, because I was playing as Muscovy, trade was not a very important thing, so I didn't really get to experience that part of it. But I'm sure that for Castile, who was making a mint, he was making tons of money based on trade. I'm sure that was a pretty big deal, and he was probably skirmishing a little bit behind the scenes with some of the other European powers like England and France, which were both played by human players. So that covers trade. It again, if you're not into trade, you really don't have to worry about it too much. But if you are, you can really get some interesting gameplay out of it. And I think that covers. Just double checking my notes. I think that covers. Oh, one of the questions that people will have is, does the trade route care about what the goods are? Do individual goods get carried over trade? And no, it's just abstracted into a certain amount of gold. There is, 10 gold worth of trade in this province. You don't care if it's wool or if it's copper or if it's whatever. It's just abstracted to just that. So the individual goods don't really matter. And yeah, so there you go. See you guys next time. Bye bye.